Thank you very much. Right. Well, I'm a lawyer, so the first question is, why would you want to hear from me at all? Well, I'm going to try and pick up from what Phil's been talking about, policy, and try and think a little bit in a couple of minutes about what sorts of laws perhaps might be conducive to promoting some of the ideas that Karen and Phil have been talking about. Lawyers, of course, are always in the way. There's a rather good bit in the Myth of Capital by Hernando de Soto about how in any given developing country it's always the lawyers who obstruct development for all sorts of reasons. So I'm going to try and break the mold, but I don't know if I'll succeed. Let me say a little bit about why someone might have thought that I would be someone who could say something useful. You won't have heard of Moncktom Chambers, and I won't explain to you who Moncktom was. But we are a chamber specialising largely in competition and procurement work. We used once to be competition, but procurement is growing very fast. And an increasing amount of our work is all over the world. One of my colleagues is in Lesotho today. Another one is in Singapore doing stuff like this. Some of it real work, real cases. Another one is in South Africa. We are building quite a lot of experience of dealing with competition and procurement work in a number of countries at different stages of development. What I've tried to gather is just a few anecdotal thoughts from my own experience and from others' experience, but they're really my interpretation of those thoughts, not anyone else's. I should add, on the procurement side, I'm also co-chair of a public procurement task force, which the International Chamber of Commerce runs, and so I get quite involved in drafting model laws on public procurement, which countries don't usually seem to take up, but there we are. UNCITRAL produces them for wallpapering people's rooms. I don't know what they're for. We might get a chance to talk about that. So what I wanted to talk about really was what sort of laws might work and what the experience has been in this area. I was glad to hear Phil describe procurement as murky. That sums up my life, probably. That is what I deal with. And one of the first times I got involved in these sorts of issues outside the UK was in a very strange weekend when I was escaping a country that should remain unnamed because my immigration status was being questioned because I was trying to mount a procurement challenge in a place which had just put in place a procurement law. So it was interesting to discover that, well, various things. The place where you lodged the procurement challenge was identified in the statute as being this such and such registry, but its actual address was a state secret. And the moment we did express a view that we wanted to promote such a challenge and where could this state secret be obtained from, all of those of us who were involved in it suddenly discovered that our visas had been revoked. So anyway, that was the first part of the weekend. The second part of the weekend, we ran away to Singapore, which may give you a sort of clue as to which part of the world we're in. And having a nice weekend in Singapore, thinking, well, what do we do now? And a friend of mine rings up and says, this is a few years back, the Americans have just insisted that we have a general anti-competition law. What does that mean, and what are we going to do about it? And so suddenly, a couple of us discovered that on Monday morning we were giving a sort of lecture on Singapore television about what a competition law was about, although the whole concept of competition was quite difficult to get over, but we dealt with that. The point about Singapore's an interesting case. I mean, it's obviously at a well-advanced stage of development, but it's interesting that a country that is well-educated, well-resourced, had not had a competition law, had it imposed on it by the US, made a choice about how to deal with competition law. And it's quite an interesting case study that of the choices that are made by a country that is well-equipped to deal with competition law, but still finds it really very difficult, and in doing so, sort of jettisons half of competition law along the way and said, this doesn't work here, this doesn't work here, we're not able to deal with it. And I'll try and touch on some of those points as we go along. I mean, one of the real problems with all of this is while there are the economics and the policy suggests that there should be competition law, there should be procurement law, the reality is that most countries do very happily without it, or at the very least they have other needs which seem to be rather more pressing than a public procurement law. What is it that actually should drive a country to think that it's a good idea to put in place such legal provisions? I would suggest that the starting point probably is trade. Not free trade necessarily, but some sort of trade. It is striking when you look at the textbooks of the development of certain countries that, and one forgets this, that historically the advanced part of Korea was North Korea. That was where the Japanese invested. That was the industrial heartland of Korea. And South Korea was a backwater. Now, Korea may not have engaged in free trade with the outside world after the war, well, from the 50s onwards, but it did engage in trade, and it was that trade which enabled it to haul itself past North Korea. I mean, maybe that North Korea also put in place some interesting policies that enabled it to go in the other direction. But it is an extreme example, perhaps, of how it's that process of trade which is important, but not necessarily, I would suggest, free trade. It may be that in this day and age we have to be a bit more humble in the West about the merits of what we're requiring of people. In order to set that trade up, it seems to me that countries ought to see really two aspects of competition and procurement law. Firstly, a benefit for themselves. There are positive benefits, although it is important when buying into competition or procurement law to decide which bits of the law do you need and to what extent is the cost of putting that law in place worth the candle. But also, of course, you're creating an environment for trade. And one of the reasons why, of course, US policymakers were driving competition law so hard during the 1990s through the bilateral investment treaties which they were signing up all over the world, was that it was creating a climate in which US companies felt comfortable. But whether it was right or wrong perhaps doesn't really matter. It was just something that US companies thought was important. And it clearly was important when dealing with US businesses in Singapore. It was that feeling that we can expand our business in Singapore because they've got a competition law. They've signed up to something that will help us. And so there's a sense of helping the outsider feel secure in trade with the nation, but also the possibility of using competition law, using procurement law for positive ends, to make sure that you can use that process to try and break up, for example, price cartels amongst pharmaceutical manufacturers. If you are the government purchaser of a pharmaceutical, you may find it's quite difficult to get behind a monolithic position which the industry is giving you. But if you can use competition law and procurement law, maybe both of them together, you may in fact be able to provoke a certain amount of competition which wouldn't otherwise exist. And so there are some positives in two respects, it seems to me, which nations may want to get out of competition and procurement law. As I said, the problem, it seems to me, has been, and it's been a problem for all countries, even the US, but it was a problem in the UK. You tend to find that competition law is this huge bulk of law. A lot of it's very controversial. It covers a huge range of commercial arrangements. Some of it is justified by economics. Some of it is constantly debated by economists as what's right or wrong. Some of it is nakedly self-serving for certain sectors of industry. I mean, the EU law on selective distribution is clearly designed only to protect the French perfume manufacturers. It has no other purpose in the world. It is not about competition, it is about sectoral protection. Anyway, that's enough of my rant. But you can get a whole area of competition law. You don't need to buy up to all of it. And one of the unfortunate features of the standard bit clause, which the US was imposing on people, was to say you have to have a general competition law. I think that what in fact nations need to do is be a bit more nuanced about this and think, well, which bits of the law do we really need? The reality of competition law is it brings bad things with it as well as good. Competition law, while on the one hand it can be a vehicle for undermining or breaking up national champions and so forth, it can also be the vehicle for promoting national champions. Competition law always has in it some process, some policy process of justifying anti-competitive restrictions in certain circumstances for certain periods. And so, again, that means there is a regulatory discretion inherent in any competition process. The more complicated it is, the more costly it is to run, the more opaque that discretion becomes, the more susceptible competition policy itself is to corruption. And we've seen that recently in Europe. I don't know whether the poor chap is guilty or not, but there's been a recent high-profile case where a very senior European regulator has ended up in the clink, I think, for taking bribes in a merger case, isn't it? These things happen. So competition policy itself brings with it the policy of abusing the market, which wouldn't otherwise be there. So it needs to be quite tightly controlled, I think, in the way one actually has to decide which bits you're going to buy into. The sort of spirit of humility when it comes to requiring the full panoply of competition law to be taken on by every nation, I think is reflected in remarks a couple of weeks ago by the chief executive of the OFT, who was talking about the difficulties of making competition policy work anyway, observing how costly and difficult competition policy has been in sectors in the UK, such as utilities, where, I mean, it's just fantastically complicated, and you wonder whether competition really has delivered the best result. I mean, we all know that somehow or other we could get cheaper gas, but how and why and on any given day does it actually do you any good? But he went on to say something I thought was rather interesting. Does this mean that the benefits of competition will be overlooked? Not necessarily, but the burden of proof on the value of competitive markets may be shifting as we speak. In the recent past, in the UK at least, a preference for market-based solutions based on confidence in the market process may have meant that those arguing for intervention had the burden of showing its alternative benefits. In future, it may be those seeking to maintain competition that bear that burden. So I do think it is that we need to show in each case why it is that a particular aspect of the law is really going to help, rather than just saying, you need a competition policy, therefore you need a competition law. Oh, and here's the Sherman Act and Article 81. You can take them, and I'm sure you chaps can work it out. Recent history of competition policy is littered with countries which have enacted these laws, which have turned out to be either useless or a hugely costly regulatory burden on the country. Useless in the sense that they sat there and nothing has happened with them for years and years and years. Yeah. So what do I think one should try to do? I think one should try and focus on a few key requirements. One should start by fixing on those things which are clearly inimical to good business, and then allow the law, as it were, to grow. Forget about restricting vertical arrangements. Most of the West has it already, or many places have. Limit oneself to a ban on price fixing to supply of goods to public authorities, and actually keep it very narrow. Don't worry about necessarily all price fixing to start with, because once one gets into some areas of price fixing, particularly, of course, in the areas of food, you end up in quite difficult areas about why food is in fact being price controlled. Start with limited price fixing, therefore, on supply of goods and perhaps works to public authorities, and you can tie that in with the public procurement law. Set a very high threshold for other horizontal violations. Other agreements between people in the same type of business. Sorry, the competition law focuses on horizontal and vertical relationships.
What is the high threshold?
Well, the high threshold, well, you would only look at the most extreme intentional restraints on competition, where there's an intention to restrict competition. Because so much of competition law in EU and the US gets bogged down in economic analysis of what the economic effect of a particular restriction is. Now, that's all very interesting and very important, and it keeps lots of lawyers and economists in business and lots of regulators in business, but I really doubt, I mean, it may be that it is worth doing in the UK, and maybe that it is worth doing in the EU, but I doubt that it's worth doing as a first port of call when you're setting up a competition policy. I think, seems to me, one sticks with the things which are clearly intended to keep someone else out, intended to act to the general detriment to the public. And there are infringements which can be shown to be intentional in that sense. I would say that one probably limits attacks on vertical issues, i.e. refusals to supply and so forth, to people who are enjoying some sort of statutory monopoly or some sort of gatekeeper status. What do I mean by gatekeeper? Someone who has an essential facility, for example, runs a port, someone who happens to control internet access in it, or whatever. Something which actually is a key gateway to doing business. But again, a lot of time is spent in the US and the EU and other OECD countries on working out what is the market and whether or not this really is anti-competitive or not. I just think that that's a cost, a regulatory cost that may be a nice to have, but is not a useful starting place. And the reason why I say one should cut back is that historically it's getting to grips with all of those trimmings which cause the real difficulty in trying to introduce competition policy, which cause the real difficulty in getting acceptance from a competition law. And it seems to me one should start with the things that work, the things that really matter. And then one ties that in with a fairly simple, straightforward public procurement law which requires contracts above a certain size to go out to an open tender process. Now, don't get me started on public procurement laws. That's another complication. Unfortunately, the international standards, it seems to me, were not designed in such a way to make them easily usable, and the new versions that we're seeing in the new version of the government procurement agreement produced by the WTO and the new UNCITRAL law seem to me to be, again, rather too complicated. But that's another 1 hour's talk. My thoughts on how you'd have a decent public procurement law, trash the GPA and UNCITRAL, but there we are. That's for another day.